"I will be their father," said the mountain man, to the girl beaten for giving birth to 4 girls. The snow-choked street falls silent as a broken mother stumbles, her children crying at her side. No one dares to help until a scarred giant steps forward. With a voice like thunder, he declares he'll be the father these girls never had. But this act of mercy lights a fire of fury. A cruel husband swears revenge. A crooked law threatens to tear the children away. And behind it all lies a secret tied to water, land, and the kind of power men will kill for. Barns burn, jail doors slam. A preacher dares to speak the truth in a town that looks away. And as a courtroom falls silent, one question echoes louder than gunfire across the Rockies. Will love and faith be enough to protect 4 little girls from a world set against them? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story. 2. The snow whips sideways across the muddy street, stinging like needles against exposed skin. Ruth Ellen clutched her youngest daughter closer, her thin shawl offering little protection against the bitter Colorado wind. Her legs trembled as she stumbled forward, one hand pressed against her side, where fresh bruises bloomed beneath her dress. "Worthless woman!" Her husband's voice boomed from the cabin door. "Can't even give me a son. Just girls, useless, all of them." Ruth Ellen's heart pounded as she heard the venom in his words. The baby whimpered, sensing her mother's distress. Outside the general store, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion. They stood like statues, faces turned away, none willing to meet her desperate gaze. Her warm boots slipped in the mud, and she lurched forward. The baby let out frightened cry as Ruth Ellen struggled to keep her balance. Just as her knees began to buckle, strong hands steadied her and gently lifted the infant from her trembling arms. Through tears and snowflakes, she looked up into the weathered face of Jonas McCrae. She'd seen him before, trading furs at the general store, but never this close. Scars crossed his cheek, and his eyes held a depth of kindness that made her breath catch. The massive buffalo coat he wore seemed to block out the whole world. The crowd fell silent, watching. Everyone knew of McCrae, the mountain man who lived alone in the high country, speaking little and keeping to himself. Now he stood like a barrier between Ruth Ellen and her raging husband, his presence commanding attention. "If no man here will stand for them," Jonas's voice carried clear and strong over the howling wind, "then I will. I will be their father." Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Ruth Ellen's 3 older daughters, who had followed her from the cabin, pressed close to her skirts. The youngest, safe in Jonas's careful hold, had stopped crying. "You got no right." Her husband's face turned purple with rage. "That's my wife and my daughters. I'll have the law on you." Jonas didn't even glance his way. Instead, he looked down at Ruth Ellen with eyes that held no judgment, only gentle concern. "Ma'am," he said softly, "your girls need shelter from this." Storm, Ruth Ellen's oldest daughter, barely 10, reached for her hand. The middle girls huddled together, watching Jonas with a mixture of fear and wonder. He shifted the baby in his arms, making sure she was wrapped secure against the cold. "I'll see you in jail for this." The husband's threats echoed off the false fronts of the shops. "Sheriff, where's the sheriff?" But Jonas was already moving, guiding Ruth Ellen and the girls toward the edge of town. His buffalo coat spread wide enough to shield the 2 smaller girls who pressed against his legs. The oldest stayed close to her mother's side, her thin shoulders straight with determination. Behind them, lamplight glowed in windows as faces appeared, watching this extraordinary scene unfold. Ruth Ellen heard the murmur of voices rising, knew that by morning the story would be on every tongue in town. The mountain man who'd claimed a beaten wife and 4 daughters as his own, defying both husband-in-law with nothing but quiet strength and conviction. Snow continued to fall, but Ruth Ellen barely felt it now. Each step away from the cabin felt like a step toward something she'd thought forever lost: hope. Jonas's steady presence beside her, the secure weight of his hand when he helped her over a slick patch of ground, the gentle way he cradled her. Youngest, it all spoke of a protection she'd never known. The girls seemed to sense it too. Their tight, fearful expressions began to soften as they walked through the deepening snow. Even the baby had settled into peaceful sleep. Tucked safely in the crook of Jonas's arm, Ruth Ellen glanced back once at the town, at the life she was leaving behind. Lamplight flickered in dozens of windows now, and she could see shadows moving, people gathering to watch and whisper. Her husband's shouts had faded, lost in the wind and distance. Jonas must have felt her hesitation. "There's shelter ahead," he said quietly, "just for her ears, and a warm fire. The girls will be safe." Ruth Ellen nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. She reached out to steady her second youngest, who had stumbled in the snow. The child looked up at her with wide eyes, and for the first time in too long, Ruth Ellen saw something other than fear in her daughter's face. They continued on through the swirling snow, this unlikely family brought together by a single act of courage. Behind them, the town buzzed with the evening's events, but ahead lay only the promise of sanctuary and the quiet strength of the man who had dared to stand when no one else would. The mountain trail twisted upward through stands of snow-laden pine, each gust of wind sending white cascades showering from the branches. Jonas McCrae led the way, his broad shoulders breaking trail through drifts that reached past his knees. The baby slept soundly against his chest, tucked beneath the warmth of his buffalo coat. Ruth Ellen followed in his tracks, each step sending sharp pains through her bruised body. Her three older daughters huddled close behind her, their thin coats offering little protection against the biting cold. The youngest among them stumbled, tears freezing on her cheeks. Jonas turned back, his keen eyes taking in their exhaustion. "Need to keep moving," he said gently, "but we'll make it easier." He shifted the sleeping baby to one arm and reached into his coat pocket, producing a small brass lantern. "Here now," he said, kneeling before the middle daughter, a girl of 7, with her mother's golden hair. "This here's an important job. Can you hold this steady?" The child's eyes widened as she wrapped her mittened hands around the lantern's handle, pride replacing fear in her expression. To her older sister, he pointed out a fallen pine branch. "Good dry kindling there. We'll need that for the fire later." The 10-year-old nodded solemnly, gathering the wood in her arms like it was precious cargo. The youngest he simply lifted onto his free hip, her small arms wrapping trustingly around his neck. Ruth Ellen watched, something tight in her chest loosening at the natural way he cared for them. No man had ever shown such gentleness to her daughters. They climbed for another hour as evening. Shadows lengthened across the snow. Ruth Ellen's limp grew more pronounced, but she pressed on, drawing strength from the sight of her children's renewed energy as they focused on their tasks. Finally, Jonas's cabin came into view, a solid structure of rough-hewn logs nestled against the mountainside. "Home," Jonas said simply, leading them to the heavy wooden door. Inside, the cabin was spare but neat. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, while basic furniture, a small table with chairs, a narrow cot, and some storage trunks filled the rest of the space. A massive bearskin rug lay before the hearth. Jonas wasted no time getting them settled. He laid the sleeping baby in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a wooden box lined with soft furs, then set about building a fire. The older girls watched in fascination as he stacked the kindling they gathered, his sure movement soon coaxing flames to life. From a hook by the fireplace, he lifted a cast-iron pot. "Venison stew," he explained, placing it near the flames. to warm. The rich aroma soon filled the cabin, making the girls' stomachs rumble audibly. "The bearskin's warm," he told them, gesturing to the rug. "Rest there while supper heats." The children needed no further encouragement, curling up together on the thick fur like a litter of exhausted puppies. Ruth Ellen remained standing by the table, her hands twisting in her torn shawl. Shame and uncertainty kept her rigid, unable to fully accept this sudden sanctuary. Jonas pulled out a chair for her, his movements careful, as if approaching a spooked deer. "Sit," he said softly. "You're safe here. Safe here." She sank into the chair, watching as he ladled stew into tin bowls for everyone. The children ate hungrily, and even Ruth Ellen found herself finishing every bite, the warm food bringing life back to her cold, numb body. As night deepened outside, snow began falling harder, drumming softly on the cabin's roof. The children's eyes grew heavy, and soon all four were sleeping soundly on the bearskin, their faces peaceful in the firelight. Jonas brought his single blanket to Ruth Ellen. "Take the cot," he said, indicating the narrow bed in the corner. "I'll sleep fine on the floor." "I can't," she began, but he shook his head. "You need proper rest to heal." Ruth Ellen's voice was barely a whisper when she finally spoke again. "Is it only pity that made you help us?" Jonas was quiet for a long moment, adding wood to the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows across his scarred face as he turned to answer her. "No pity," he said firmly. "Just right." Outside, the snow continued falling, blanketing the world in pristine white. Inside the cabin, Ruth Ellen lay awake on the cot, watching Jonas's steady breathing where he slept on the floor near her children. For the first time in years, she felt the tentative stirring of hope. This rough mountain cabin had become their refuge, fragile as it might be, and the man who granted it had given them something even more precious. The chance to feel safe. Morning painted the mountain world in fresh glory. Sunlight sparkled off snow-laden branches and cast long shadows across the drifts surrounding Jonas's cabin. Ruth Ellen stood at the window, cradling her youngest while taking in the view. A frozen creek wound through the valley below, its ice-glazed surface glinting like scattered diamonds. Towering pines marched up the slopes, their dark green needles dusted white. Beyond them, jagged peaks thrust into a cloudless blue sky. The sharp crack of an axe drew her attention. Jonas had been up since dawn, methodically building their woodpile. Now he was showing her older daughters how to split smaller logs, positioning their hands carefully on child-sized axes he'd found in his tool shed. "Like this," he demonstrated, his own massive axe making clean work of a pine round. "Let the weight do the work. Don't force it." 10-year-old Mary attempted to copy his motion, her face scrunched in concentration. The axe stuck halfway through her log, and she tugged at it futilely. "Here now," Jonas said, moving to help. His explanation came out awkward and halting, but the girls giggled at his earnestness. A ghost of a smile crossed his weathered face at their laughter. Inside the cabin, Ruth Ellen winced as she reached for the flour bin, her bruises still tender. But she was determined to contribute. "I can manage biscuits," she insisted when Jonas had tried to wave her back to rest. "And coffee, too." He studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Just don't overdo," he warned, then returned to his woodcutting lesson. As morning stretched toward noon, the children discovered the simple pleasures of mountain life. Jonas showed them how to use strips of bark as makeshift sleds, sending them squealing down gentle slopes. Even the youngest toddled through the snow, delighting in its crunch beneath her boots. The old mule in Jonas's lean-to proved a particular favorite. The girls took turns offering it handfuls of hay, shrieking with laughter when its soft lips tickled their palms. Jonas watched from nearby, his usual stern expression softening as he supervised their play. Yet tension threaded through their peaceful day. Ruth Ellen started at every unexpected sound, her eyes darting to the trail leading down the mountain. Jonas noticed but said nothing, simply positioning himself between the cabin and the path more often than not. As evening approached, Ruth Ellen stirred a pot of rabbit stew while watching Jonas show the girls how to stack wood properly against the cabin wall. The question that had burned in her mind all day finally spilled out. "Why did you do it?" she asked when he came inside. "Why step forward for us?" Jonas paused in the act of hanging up his coat, firelight catching the web of scars on his face. For a long moment, he was silent, and Ruth Ellen feared she'd pushed too far. But then he spoke, his voice low and certain. "Children don't deserve a father's fists," he said simply. "They deserve a father's hands." He looked down at his own huge calloused hands, hands that had been so gentle lifting her baby, so patient teaching her girls. Understanding bloomed in Ruth Ellen's heart, though questions about his scars and past remained unasked. A wolf's howl echoed through the gathering dusk, answered by others in the distance. The girls huddled closer to the fire, but Jonas seemed unbothered. "They won't. Come here," he assured them, ladling out bowls of stew. "Not with the smoke and light." Still, the wolf's song served as a reminder. Safety up here was as fragile as the thin gray smoke curling from their chimney. Ruth Ellen saw it in Jonas's watchful gaze, in the way he checked his rifle before settling in for the night. There, sanctuary existed on the edge of wilderness, preserved by vigilance and trust. The children drifted to sleep on their bearskin bed, warm and content despite the wolves' chorus. Ruth Ellen watched Jonas bank the fire for the night, his movements sure and practiced. Whatever darkness had marked him in the past, whatever wounds he carried, he had chosen to be their protector. Not from pity, as he'd said, but from a deep-rooted belief in what was right. Outside, the wolves called to each other across the snowy peaks. Inside, the cabin held its own kind of wild beauty, the beauty of safety found in unexpected places, of trust given and received, of a family forming from the broken pieces of other lives. 2 days passed like a gentle stream, each hour washing away a little more fear from Ruth Ellen and her daughters. On the morning of the third day, Jonas rose early to hitch his mule to a wooden sled. The beast stomped and snorted, its breath steaming in the crisp mountain air while Jonas secured the harness with practiced hands. "Town's necessary," he explained to Ruth Ellen as she helped bundle the younger girls in warm shawls. Running low on flour and such. The oldest daughter, Mary, clutched the supply list in her mittened hands while her sisters nestled into the straw-padded sled. Ruth Ellen sat among them, drawing her worn coat tight. Jonas took his place at the front, clicking his tongue to urge the mule forward. Their descent from the mountain took most of the morning. The sled runners cut clean tracks through fresh snow until they reached the lower slopes, where winter's grip had begun to soften. By the time they entered town, the streets had turned to brown slush, spattering the sled sides. Townsfolk stopped their business to stare. Some stood in doorways, others gathered in small clusters, their whispers following the unusual family-like autumn leaves in a breeze. A few men touched their hats in approval, while others turned away with obvious disgust. Outside the general store, Jonas helped Ruth Ellen and the girls down from the sled. The bell above the door announced their entrance with a cheerful jingle that seemed at odds with the shopkeeper's sour expression. "Flour," Jonas stated, placing a small sack of coins on the counter. The shopkeeper's eyes darted between Jonas and Ruth Ellen, before landing on the 4 girls exploring the candy jars. "Girls are costly mouths to feed," he muttered, measuring out the flour with deliberate slowness. "Especially when they ain't your own." Jonas didn't move, but something in his stance changed. His shadow seemed to lengthen across the counter as he fixed the shopkeeper with a steady gaze. The man's hands faltered in their work, and he dropped. His eyes, Continuing his task in silence, Ruth Ellen touched Jonas's arm gently. "We need sugar too," she whispered. "For preserves come spring." He nodded, his expression softening as he added it to their order. The rest of their transaction passed without comment, though the shopkeeper's disapproval hung heavy in the air. Their next stop was the church, a modest white-painted building with a crooked cross atop its steeple. Preacher Alton Briggs stood on the steps, his kind face breaking into a warm smile at their approach. "Sister Ruth Ellen," he greeted, taking her hands in his. "The Lord provides in mysterious ways." His eyes moved to Jonas, measuring but not. "Unkind, though I fear man's laws may not share heaven's wisdom." The preacher drew Jonas aside, while Ruth Ellen showed her daughters the church's small garden. Winter bare but promising spring's return. "Custom and law favor blood ties," Alton warned in low tones. "Your guardianship, while righteous, stands on shaky ground." Jonas absorbed this with his usual stoic silence, though his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. After loading their supplies, he left Ruth Ellen and the girls at the mercantile to look at fabric while he sought out news at the saloon. He didn't enter the establishment, but stood in the shadows nearby, listening to the talk that spilled out with the lamplight. Through the tobacco smoke and cattle gossip came the words he dreaded. Ruth Ellen's husband planned to file legal claim for the girls. Something about property tied to their maternal grandfather, rights that couldn't be severed by a stranger's interference. The ride home was quieter than their morning journey. The mules' hooves made soft sounds in the dying light as they climbed back into the mountains. Only when the cabin was in sight, smoke rising straight from its chimney into the purple dusk, did Jonas break the silence. "Need to tell you something," he said as they settled inside. The girls were already drooping with exhaustion, curled together on their bearskin bed, Ruth Ellen's hands stilled in the act of hanging up coats. "I saw it in your face earlier," she said softly. "What is it?" Jonas laid out what he'd heard in measured words, watching fear bloom in her eyes like frost on a window pane. Her hands began to shake, and she gripped the back of a chair to steady herself. "He'll take them," she whispered. "He'll use his father's property rights to take my girls." Jonas moved to the table and placed one large hand flat upon its surface. The lamplight caught his scars, but also the unwavering certainty in his eyes. "Then we'll fight with truth," he vowed, his quiet voice carrying the weight of mountains. The next morning dawned bitter cold, with frost patterns decorating the cabin's small windows. Jonas rose before first light, moving quietly so as not to wake the girls still curled together on their bearskin. He built up the fire and set coffee to boil while Ruth Ellen stirred, her face drawn with worry about the day ahead. "County seat's a fair piece," Jonas explained as he pulled on his heavy coat. "Let's get an early start." Outside, his breath clouded in the pre-dawn air as he saddled his sturdy mountain horse. The beast's dark coat was thick with winter fur, steam rising from its flanks as Jonas cinched the girth tight. Behind him, Ruth Ellen helped the girls into the sled, wrapping them in every blanket they owned. "Mama, I'm scared," whispered little Sarah, the youngest, as Ruth Ellen tucked the blankets around her. "Hush now," Ruth Ellen soothed, though her own hands trembled. "Mr. Jonas knows what he's doing." The sun was just touching the mountain peaks when they set out, Jonas leading on horseback with the sled following behind. Their path wound through frozen valleys and over ridge lines where the wind cut sharp as a knife. The girls huddled together for warmth, occasionally pointing out elk tracks in the snow or eagles soaring overhead. Near midday, they stopped in a sheltered grove to share hard biscuits and jerky. Jonas helped the girls stretch their legs while Ruth Ellen rebuilt their nest of blankets. His quiet strength seemed to calm them all. Though he spoke little, the afternoon brought them down from the high country into more settled lands. The county seat lay in a broad valley, its courthouse standing proud with a fresh coat of white paint. By the time they arrived, shadows were long across the muddy street, and lamps were being lit in shop windows. "Just in time," Jonas muttered, helping Ruth Ellen and the girls from the sled. Their legs were stiff from the cold journey, but there was no time to rest. Inside the courthouse, their boots echoed on wooden floors. The clerk's office was lit by a single oil lamp, casting yellow light over stacks of leather-bound records. The clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, peered at them over wire-rimmed spectacles. "Land rights?" he repeated, pulling out a heavy book. "Yes, I see here. The Carter girls inherit through their maternal grandfather's deed. Quite valuable timber claims up there." Jonas nodded slowly. "And their protection?" The clerk's expression grew careful. "Well now, that's more complicated. Law tends to favor the father in such matters. Unless," he glanced at Ruth Ellen's fading bruises, "unless there's proven cruelty. But that takes witnesses willing to testify." Ruth Ellen's hands twisted in her skirt as Jonas began filling out the protection paperwork. The scratch of his pen seemed loud in the quiet office. The girls pressed close to their mother, eyes wide as they watched him write. The door burst open, letting in a blast of cold air, and 3 men. Ruth Ellen's husband stood in front, his face twisted in an ugly smirk. 2 rough-looking companions flanked him, their stance threatening. "Well, well," Carter drawled, spitting tobacco juice on the clean floor. "If it ain't the mountain man trying to steal my family." Jonas continued writing, his hand steady. Only when he'd finished the last page did he turn, placing himself between Carter and Ruth Ellen. "Ain't stealing what's already fled," he said quietly. Carter took a step forward, but quick footsteps in the hallway made him pause. The judge, a gray-haired man with sharp eyes, appeared in the doorway. "What's all this then?" he demanded, taking in the scene. The clerk hurried to explain the situation while both parties glared at each other across the room. The judge listened, then nodded decisively. "This needs proper hearing," he declared. 2 weeks from today, I'll review the case. Both parties will present their claims." He fixed Carter with a stern look. "And there'll be no trouble before then, understood?" Carter spat again, but nodded. "Fortnight's not long to wait for what's mine," he sneered, then turned and left with his companions. Outside, stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Ruth Ellen helped the girls back into the sled, her movements wooden with exhaustion and fear. Jonas secured the blankets around them before turning to her. "We're not beaten yet," he said simply. Ruth Ellen looked up at him, seeing determination in his scarred face. For the first time that day, she felt a flutter of hope in her chest. "No," she agreed softly. "We're not beaten yet." The days that followed settled into a gentle rhythm at Jonas's mountain cabin. Morning light would find him already outside, showing the girls how to check rabbit snares along the tree line. Their small hands, once soft from town life, grew confident with each new task. "Like this," Jonas demonstrated, guiding 8-year-old Mary's hands as she arranged twine into a careful loop. "The rabbit follows its path, right through here." Her eyes brightened with understanding as she copied his movements. Even 6-year-old Sarah learned to carry small logs for the woodpile, her face serious with concentration as she mimicked her older sisters. Jonas watched them work, his expression softening whenever they mastered a new skill. The frozen creek became their daily adventure. Jonas taught them to test the ice's thickness before stepping out to fill their buckets. "Listen to the water singing underneath," he'd say, and the girls would press their ears to the crystalline surface, giggling at the mysterious gurgling. Below, inside the cabin, Ruth Ellen kept busy with domestic tasks. Her bruises were fading to yellow, though she still moved carefully, as if expecting pain. By lamplight each evening, she'd mend clothes with precise stitches, her needle flashing silver in the dim light. Sometimes she'd pause, watching her daughters laugh and play, wonder crossing her face like she was seeing them anew. One particularly snowy evening, after supper dishes were cleared, Jonas disappeared into his storage chest. The girls watched curiously as he pulled out an old fiddle, its wood smooth from years of handling. "You play?" Ruth Ellen asked softly from her chair by the fire. Jonas ran his fingers along the instrument's curves. "Been a spell," he admitted. But when he tucked it under his chin and drew the bow across the strings, music filled the cabin like warmth from the hearth. The tune was simple but lively, and soon the girls were clapping along. 10-year-old Elizabeth grabbed Sarah's hands, spinning her in circles while Mary and 9-year-old Jane linked arms, skipping around the table. Their boots thumped against the wooden floor in time with the music. Ruth Ellen began to hum, her voice tentative at first, then stronger. A genuine smile spread across her face, the first Jonas had seen since that snowy day in town. The lamplight caught the gold in her hair, the spark returning to her eyes. Jonas found himself watching her more than the dancing girls, noting how her shoulders had straightened, how she held herself with growing confidence despite her healing wounds. The evening might have continued in this way, full of music and laughter, if heavy boots hadn't sounded on the porch. Jonas lowered his fiddle, motioning the girls to silence. 3 sharp knocks echoed through the cabin. "Jonas," a deep voice called. "It's Henry." Relief crossed Jonas's face as he opened the door to reveal a middle-aged Ute scout wrapped in a wool blanket against the cold. Snow dusted his dark hair and shoulders as he stepped inside, nodding respectfully to Ruth Ellen and the girls. "Henry Red Elk," Jonas introduced him. "Trusted friend." The girls watched wide-eyed as Henry settled near the fire, accepting a cup of coffee from Ruth Ellen with murmured thanks. Steam rose between his weathered hands as he gathered his thoughts. "Broad news," Henry said finally, his voice grave. "Been watching the trails. Carter's men, about 3 hired guns from Denver way. Been scouting these slopes past 2 days." Jonas's jaw tightened. "How close?" "Too close." Henry's dark eyes reflected the firelight. "They know the value of this land, the water rights. Carter means to force you down before the hearing." He glanced at Ruth Ellen, who had gone pale. "Water is life. They'll fight for it." Jonas nodded grimly, understanding the warning in Henry's words. Violence was coming, as surely as spring followed winter. He looked at Ruth Ellen and her daughters, who had drawn together like deer-sensing wolves nearby. "Much obliged for the warning," Jonas said quietly. Henry rose, settling his blanket around his shoulders. "I'll keep watch," he promised. "Send word if they move closer." He touched his chest in farewell, a gesture Jonas returned with respect. After Henry departed, silence hung heavy in the cabin. The fiddle lay forgotten on the table, its music replaced by the wind's mournful song through the pines. Ruth Ellen gathered her daughters close. Their earlier joy turned to anxiety. Jonas moved to bank the fire for the night, his movements deliberate and controlled. But his thoughts were already turning to defense, to the rifle above the door, to the paths. That would need guarding. The peaceful rhythm they built here felt suddenly fragile as spring ice, ready to crack at the first wrong step. Jonas spent the next morning fortifying the cabin. His movements were purposeful as he dragged heavy logs from the woodpile, stacking them strategically against the outer walls. The rough-hewn timber would stop most bullets, creating a shield around their sanctuary. Inside, he positioned rifles at key points, one by the front window, another near the kitchen, and his trusted Sharps rifle above the door. Each weapon he loaded carefully, checking the mechanisms with practiced hands. Ruth Ellen watched from the doorway, her face drawn with worry. "Must we prepare for such violence?" she asked, wringing her apron between her fingers. "Surely there's another way." Jonas paused in his work, meeting her troubled gaze. Better to be ready than to regret, he said quietly. His scarred hands rested on a stack of ammunition boxes. I've seen too many good folks fall because they weren't prepared. The girls helped too, though Jonas kept them away from the weapons. They carried water buckets inside, filled oil lamps, and stored extra food in the root cellar. Even little Sarah understood the gravity of their task. Her usual chatter subdued to whispers. Days passed under a blanket of uneasy quiet. Jonas took to patrolling the property boundaries, his rifle always close at hand. Ruth Ellen kept the girls near the cabin, jumping at every snapping twig or cry of a distant hawk. The attack came on a crisp afternoon while Jonas was checking the livestock. The first shot cracked through the air like breaking ice, sending splinters flying from the barn door near his head. More bullets followed, thudding into the weathered wood with deadly purpose. Jonas dove behind a water trough, his Sharps rifle already rising to his shoulder. He spotted movement in the tree line. 3 men, just as Henry had warned. Their rifles glinted in the winter sun as they tried to work their way closer. Ruth Ellen, Jonas bellowed over the gunfire. Get to the cellar. Through the chaos, he saw Ruth Ellen herding her daughters toward the cabin's back door. Elizabeth carried Sarah, while Jane and Mary ran ahead, their faces white with terror. A bullet whined past them, striking the cabin wall. Jonas's rifle roared in response, the heavy slug forcing one attacker to duck behind a pine tree. He worked the lever smoothly, chambering another round. The familiar motions brought back memories of war, but this time he had more than just himself to protect. The firefight intensified. Jonas's position behind the trough grew more precarious as the attackers spread out, trying to flank him. He needed to fall back to the cabin, but first he had to make sure Ruth Ellen and the girls were safely below ground. A shout from the tree line made him risk a quick look. One of the men had produced a torch, its flame bright against the winter shadows. Before Jonas could squeeze off a shot, the man hurled it onto the barn's hay-strewn floor. Flames caught instantly, racing up the dry timbers. Smoke began to pour from the eaves as the livestock inside panicked, their frightened cries filling the valley. Jonas's horse crashed through the barn door, followed by his mule and 2 milk cows. They scattered into the woods, tails high, in terror. Using the smoke for cover, Jonas sprinted for the cabin. Bullets kicked up dirt around his feet, but he made it inside, slamming the door behind him. Through the window, he watched his barn become an inferno, years of stored hay feeding the hungry flames. Jonas? Ruth Ellen's voice drifted up from the cellar trapdoor. Are you hurt? I'm fine, he assured her, keeping his rifle trained on the tree line. The attackers had stopped shooting, apparently satisfied with the destruction they'd caused. Through the thickening smoke, he saw them retreating into the forest, their message delivered. When it seemed safe, Ruth Ellen and the girls emerged from the cellar. They huddled together in the cabin's main room, watching the barn burn through. Tear-filled eyes. The girls clung to their mother while Jonas stood guard at the window, his expression hard as granite. Ruth Ellen's hand found his arm, gripping it tightly. They won't stop, she whispered, her voice trembling. Not until they've destroyed everything. Jonas covered her hand with his own, feeling the slight tremor in her fingers. We'll stand firm, he promised, though his gut twisted with worry. The law might indeed prove a harder obstacle than bullets, especially with Ruth Ellen's husband holding influence over the local judge. Night fell early, hastened by smoke that turned the sunset blood red. The family stayed close together in the cabin's one room, all thoughts of sleep forgotten. Sarah whimpered occasionally, burying her face in Ruth Ellen's skirts. The older girls sat silent on their bedrolls, jumping at every pop from the barns. Dying embers. Jonas moved between windows, watching for any sign of the attacker's return. The barn's skeleton glowed orange in the darkness, a beacon of destruction that illuminated their vulnerability. Ash floated on the wind like evil snow, coating everything with gray despair. 2 days after the barn burning, hoofbeats echoed through the valley. Jonas looked up from mending the cabin's door to see Sheriff Calloway leading 3 deputies up the snow-crusted trail. Their badges glinted in the morning sun, their faces set with grim purpose. Jonas set down his hammer and straightened. Slowly, he'd known this moment might come, but the sight of lawmen still sent his heart plummeting. Behind him, he heard Ruth Ellen gathering the girls inside, their excited chatter falling silent as they sensed the tension. Sheriff Calloway dismounted first, his spurs jangling against the packed earth. "Jonas McCrae," he called out, one hand resting near his holstered pistol. "I've got papers here naming you in interference with lawful custody. The children are safe here," Jonas said quietly, though he knew the words would make no difference. The law was the law, no matter how wrong it might be. That ain't for you to decide. Calloway produced a set of iron manacles. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Come peaceful and nobody gets hurt." The cabin door burst open. Ruth Ellen rushed out, her face pale but determined. "You can't take him. He's protected us, given us shelter when no one else would." "Ma'am," Calloway said, his tone softening slightly, "the law is clear. Your husband has legal custody until the hearing. Mr. McCrae here had no right to remove you and the children from his home." The girls appeared in the doorway, their eyes wide with fear. Little Sarah started crying, while Jane and Mary clung to Elizabeth's skirts. Jonas felt their gazes on him like physical weight. He'd promised to be their father, to keep them safe. Now he was being stripped of that duty by cold iron and colder law. "It's all right," Jonas said, keeping his voice steady for their sake. He held out his wrists to the sheriff, not wanting the children to witness any struggle. The manacles clicked shut, cold metal biting into his skin. "Papa Jonas." Sarah broke free from her sisters and ran toward him. Ruth Ellen caught her, pulling the sobbing child back as the deputies moved to flank Jonas. "Where will they go?" Jonas demanded, his calm facade cracking. "You can't send them back to that man." Sheriff Calloway mounted his horse, gesturing for his deputies to bring Jonas to their waiting horses. By law, Ruth Ellen and the girls returned to their proper home until the hearing. Court's orders. Ruth Ellen's face went white, but she lifted her chin defiantly. Drawing her daughters close, she whispered something to them that made them stand straighter despite their tears. Then, louder, she called out, "We'll endure until Jonas returns." Jonas tried to turn back, to say something, anything, but the deputies urged him forward. They helped him mount awkwardly with his hands bound, then tied the reins of his horse to one of theirs. As they started down the trail, he caught one last glimpse of his family framed in the cabin doorway. The sight burned into his memory. Ruth Ellen standing tall, the girls clustered around her, their home behind them like a broken promise. The ride to town seemed to take forever, though it couldn't have been more than a few hours. Jonas sat stiffly in the saddle, his thoughts churning with worry for Ruth Ellen and the girls. The sheriff's men watched him carefully, but there was no need. He wouldn't run, not when escape might hurt his family's chances at the hearing. The jail was a squat building of stone and iron, smelling of dust and old sweat. They led Jonas to a cell near the back, removing his manacles only after the barred door clanged shut. He sat heavily on the narrow cot, his hands clenching into fists as he heard Ruth Ellen's husband laughing somewhere in the street outside. Evening brought Preacher Alton, his kind face appearing between the bars. "Brother Jonas," he said softly, "I came as soon as I heard." Jonas didn't respond, lost in dark thoughts of Ruth Ellen and her daughters, trapped once again under her husband's roof. The preacher waited patiently, then spoke again. "Don't lose hope. God's justice moves in ways we can't always see. What justice lets a man beat his wife and daughters? Jonas's voice was rough with emotion. What God allows innocent children to suffer? The same God who moved your heart to help them, Alton replied. This trial isn't over, Jonas. Keep faith in the law, in justice, in the strength of the love. You've shown those girls. Jonas turned away, unable to voice his fears. He'd finally found a family, people who needed him as much as he needed them. Now the law threatened to tear them apart forever. The cell grew darker as evening deepened into night, but Jonas barely noticed. He sat motionless on his cot, his calloused hands clenched tight enough to whiten his knuckles, haunted by memories of Sarah's tears and Ruth Ellen's brave final words. Lamplight flickered against dirty windows as Ruth Ellen tucked her daughters into bed. The familiar creaks of her husband's house felt wrong now, threatening after the peace they'd known in Jonas's cabin. Her youngest, Sarah, clung to her sleeve. I want Papa Jonas, Sarah whispered. Tears gleaming on her cheeks, Ruth Ellen stroked her daughter's hair, careful to keep her voice low. Hush now, little one. We must be brave, like he taught us. From downstairs came the sound of breaking glass, followed by cruel laughter. Her husband was drinking again with his friends, celebrating their return. Ruth Ellen pulled the thin blanket higher over her daughters. Time for our prayers, she whispered. The girls clasped their hands together as Ruth Ellen led them in the quiet words Jonas had taught them. Lord, watch over us through the darkness. Heavy boots stomped up the stairs, cutting their prayer short. The door crashed open, and her husband lurched in, whiskey on his breath. Praying to your mountain man? He sneered, swaying slightly. Won't do you no good. Soon as the hearing's done, that land's mine. Ruth Ellen stood, placing herself between him and the beds. The land belongs to the girls. Their grandfather meant it for them. He laughed, the sound sharp and ugly. Fool woman, you really think that wild man cares about you? About these useless girls? He kicked at a toy Sarah had left on the floor. Once I get that water rights deed, he'll forget you ever existed. The girls huddled together, silent tears tracking down their faces. Ruth Ellen felt rage building in her chest, but she forced it down. They needed her strong, not reckless. Get some sleep, her husband growled, stumbling back toward the door. Tomorrow you'll all learn your proper place again. After he left, Ruth Ellen gathered her daughters close, humming softly until their tears subsided. Only when they finally slept did she allow herself to cry, muffling the sounds in her shawl. Miles away, in the county jail, Jonas sat on his narrow cot. Snow drifted past the barred window, reminding him of peaceful evenings at the cabin. His fingers traced the rough stone wall, mind wandering to darker memories. He saw again the blood-soaked fields of Shiloh, heard the screams of dying men. His brothers, Tom and Matthew, had fallen there, leaving him alone with his grief. The mountains had offered escape, a place to bury his pain in solitude, until Ruth Ellen and her daughters had awakened something he thought long dead, the need to protect, to love, to be a father. A shadow passed his cell door. Something white slipped beneath it, a folded scrap of paper. Jonas waited until the footsteps faded before retrieving it. In the dim light, he recognized Ruth Ellen's careful handwriting. You already are their father. Don't let them take that from us. Jonas pressed the note to his chest, feeling tears burn in his eyes for the first time since Shiloh. The words struck deep past all his carefully built walls. In those few simple lines, Ruth Ellen had named the truth he'd been afraid to admit. They were his family now, as surely as if they shared his blood. He thought of Sarah's laughter as he taught her to fish, of Jane's proud smile when she split her first log, of Mary's quiet strength, so like her mother's, of Elizabeth's protective care for her sisters. He thought of Ruth Ellen's grace, her courage, the way she made his lonely cabin feel like home. Resolve hardened in his chest like iron. He would fight for them not just in court, but with every breath he had, even if it meant facing his past. Telling the judge about the war, about why he understood the sacred duty of protecting the innocent. Even if it meant losing everything else, he would not lose them. Jonas folded Ruth Ellen's note carefully, tucking it into his shirt pocket near his heart. Outside his cell, snow continued falling, each flake a silent promise. He would find a way. For Ruth Ellen, for the girls, for the family they had become. He would find a way. His fingers brushed the paper through his shirt, feeling the slight crinkle. Ruth Ellen's words echoed in his mind. You already are their father. Not even iron bars could take that truth from him now. In the growing darkness, Jonas began to plan, his warrior's mind turning over every option, every argument, every chance to keep his family safe. That dawn broke cold and clear over the county seat. Frost glazed the courthouse windows as townsfolk gathered, their breath forming clouds in the morning air. Some stamped their feet against the chill. Others huddled in small groups, whispering about the scandal that had brought them here. The heavy doors creaked open. Ruth Ellen stepped through, head held high despite the dark circles under her eyes. Her 4 daughters clustered close, their dresses clean but worn. Sarah, the youngest, clutched her mother's skirts while the older girls, Jane, Mary, and Elizabeth, linked hands in a protective chain. There she comes, acting proud, someone muttered from the crowd. After leaving her rightful home, Ruth Ellen kept walking, her back straight as a pine. She had spent the morning brushing her daughter's hair, telling them to remember Jonas's strength. Now, she needed that strength herself. The courthouse filled quickly, wooden benches groaning under the weight of curiosity. Sheriff Calloway led Jonas in through a side door, chains clinking at his wrists. Despite the irons, Jonas moved with dignity, his scarred face calm. His eyes found Ruth Ellen and the girls, sending them a slight nod that carried more warmth. Thenwards, Ruth Ellen's husband strutted in moments later, wearing a new coat and followed by his drinking companions. Blood tells, he announced loudly, pointing at the girls. They're mine by right and nature. No mountain hermit can change that. Judge Harrison, gray-haired and stern-faced, rapped his gavel. The sound echoed through the packed room. This court will have order, he declared. We are here to determine custody of the Carter children and settlement of associated property rights. The sheriff stepped forward, unlocking Jonas's chains. Jonas rubbed his wrists, but remained standing tall, his presence filling the courtroom like a mountain shadow. Mr. McCrae, the judge said, you stand accused of interfering with a father's lawful custody. What say you to these charges? Jonas's voice came steady and clear. I say I acted to protect innocent children from harm. He turned, facing the crowd. On that snowy morning, I saw Ruth Ellen Carter stumbling through the street, carrying her baby. Her face was bruised, her other girls trembling. Not one soul moved to help. Murmurs rippled through the courthouse. Ruth Ellen's husband shifted in his chair, face darkening. I saw the marks of fists, Jonas continued. Heard him call his own daughters worthless. Where I come from, a father's hands are meant for lifting up, not striking down. Lies! Ruth Ellen's husband surged to his feet. She's clumsy, always falling. And those girls, nothing but burdens, eating my food, using up my land. The judge's gavel cracked again. Mr. Carter, you will keep your peace or be removed. He nodded to Jonas. Continue, Mr. McCrae. Jonas described the nights of terror the girls had revealed, the threats, the broken bones poorly healed. His words fell like stones in still water, spreading ripples of discomfort through the crowd. Some women dabbed at their eyes. Even the sheriff looked troubled. He lies for their land, Ruth Ellen's husband spat. That's all this is about, water rights worth a fortune. The judge raised his hand. I believe we have a witness regarding the property deed. Henry Red Elk stepped forward. Henry moved through the crowd, his moccasins silent on the wooden floor. He carried himself with quiet dignity, ignoring the suspicious glares from some townsfolk. I knew the girl's grandfather, Henry said, his voice soft but carrying. He was a fair man who respected treaties and boundaries. From his leather vest, he drew out a folded paper, yellowed with age. Before he died, he gave me this for safekeeping. Said some men's greed might threaten his granddaughter's future. The judge took the document carefully, studying its faded ink. Ruth Ellen's husband leaned forward, face reddening as he recognized the paper. This deed, the judge announced, specifically grants the land and its water rights to his granddaughters by name. It is properly witnessed and recorded. He looked up sharply. Mr. Carter, did you know of this document's existence? That's impossible, the husband stammered. I searched his papers myself after he died. There was nothing, because he knew you would destroy it, Henry said quietly. He saw the darkness in your heart. The courthouse erupted in whispers. Ruth Ellen pressed her hands to her mouth, tears sliding down her cheeks. Her daughters clung to her, hope beginning to shine in their eyes. The judge studied the deed again, his expression grave. Ruth Ellen's husband stood, fists clenched, but his friends were already edging away from him. The tide of sympathy in the room had turned, flowing now toward the quiet family standing together, toward the mountain man who had dared to step forward when no one else would. The tension in the courthouse thickened as three rough-looking men pushed through the doors. Their spurs jingled against the wooden floor, hands hovering near their gun belts. Ruth Ellen recognized them as the same men who torched Jonas's barn. Your Honor, the tallest one called out, this whole proceeding needs dismissing. We got evidence that McCrae threatened Carter's family, forced them up that mountain. Jonas's jaw tightened, but he remained still, his eyes steady on the judge. Order! Judge Harrison's gavel cracked sharply. This court will not be disrupted by uninvited parties. The hired guns pressed forward anyway, boots scuffing against the floorboards. Ain't right, another growled. Man's got rights to his own bloodkin. One more word, the judge warned, and you'll all face contempt charges. This is a court of law, not a saloon. Ruth Ellen clutched her daughters closer as the men glowered, their presence dark as storm clouds. The youngest whimpered, burying her face in her mother's skirts. Preacher Alton rose slowly from his bench, his weathered face grave. Silence fell as he stepped into the center of the room, Bible clutched in his work-worn hands. Your Honor, he began, voice carrying clear as a church bell. I've ridden these mountains for 20 years, bringing God's word to mining camps and homesteads alike. I've seen law twisted to serve greed, seen justice perverted by men who quote Scripture but harbor violence in their hearts. He turned, addressing the whole room. This court is not only bound by law, but by justice. These children, he gestured to the girls, deserve safety, not tyranny. The good book tells us true religion is caring for widows and orphans in their distress. These girls may have a living father, but they were orphans in spirit until Jonas. McCrae stepped forward. Murmurs rippled through the courthouse. Ruth Ellen saw several women nodding, some wiping tears. Even the hired guns shifted uncomfortably. Jonas stood then, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the afternoon light streaming through the windows. His voice, usually so certain, cracked with emotion. A father is not proved by sons, he said quietly. It's proved by love. These past weeks, I've watched these girls learn to laugh again, seen their mother stand straight without fear. That's worth more than any deed or bloodline. Ruth Ellen felt a tug at her skirts. Her eldest, Jane, stepped forward, chin raised. Despite her trembling, her sisters followed, forming a brave little line before the judge's bench. "Please, sir," Jane whispered, though her voice carried in the hushed room. "We want to stay with Jonas. He teaches us things, not just hitting. He shows us how to be strong, like Mama." Mary, the second eldest, nodded. "He plays fiddle for us, tells us we're smart. And he makes good stew," little Sarah added, bringing a ripple of gentle laughter through the courthouse. Ruth Ellen watched the judge's face soften. He removed his wire-rimmed spectacles, polishing them slowly with a handkerchief. When he looked at the girls again, his stern expression had gentled. "I see much to consider here," he said. "Law must serve justice, not merely tradition." He replaced his spectacles and straightened in his chair. "This court will recess until sundown. I will deliver my judgment then." The gavel fell with finality. As people began filing out, Ruth Ellen saw her husband's face, dark with rage, but also something else. Fear, perhaps. Fear that his grip on them was finally loosening. Jonas caught her eye across the room, and in his steady gaze she found strength. Whatever came at sundown, they would face it together, as a family bound by choice rather than blood. The girls clustered around her again as the courthouse slowly emptied, their small hands seeking hers. Through the windows, the afternoon sun painted long shadows across the valley, marking the slow march toward evening's verdict. Golden sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, painting long shadows across the wooden floor. The packed benches creaked under the weight of what seemed like the entire town, all gathered to witness the judge's verdict. Ruth Ellen sat rigid, her daughters pressed close, watching the last rays of day fade against the wall. Her husband stalked back and forth near the front, his boots wearing a path in the floorboards. Every few turns, he'd shoot a venomous glare toward Jonas, who stood straight and calm, his scarred hands folded before him. Sheriff Calloway positioned his deputies near the doors, their badges catching the dying light. The air felt thick with anticipation, like the moment before a summer storm breaks dawn at precisely sundown. Judge Harrison entered, his black robes rustling as he mounted the bench. The room rose in unison, then settled at his gesture. He arranged his papers deliberately, adjusted his spectacles, and surveyed the crowded courthouse. "This case," he began, his voice carrying to every corner, "presents complex questions of law and justice. We must weigh traditional rights against evident truth." He paused, looking directly at Ruth Ellen's husband. "The law has long favored a father's claim to his children, but law must serve justice, not merely tradition." Ruth Ellen felt her heart hammering against her ribs. The youngest girl clutched her hand tight enough to hurt. "I have reviewed the evidence thoroughly," the judge continued. "The testimony of witnesses, the property deed, and most importantly, the clear wishes of the children themselves." He lifted a document from his desk. "Therefore, I rule as follows. Custody of the 4 minor children shall rest jointly with their mother, Ruth Ellen Carter, and Jonas McCrae, who has demonstrated both the will and capability to act as their guardian." A gasp rippled through the courthouse. Ruth Ellen's husband froze mid-stride, his face darkening like a thundercloud. Furthermore, the judge raised his voice over the growing murmur. "The deed to the contested land shall be held in trust for the girls, as their grandfather intended. This court appoints Jonas McCrae and Ruth Ellen Carter as joint trustees until the children reach their majority." "No!" Ruth Ellen's husband exploded, whirling toward the bench. "This is theft, corruption." His face had turned purple with rage. One of his hired guns reached for his shoulder, trying to calm him. What happened next unfolded in the space of a breath. Ruth Ellen's husband spun, his fist connecting with his hired man's jaw with a sickening crack. The man sprawled backward into the gallery as women screamed and people scrambled away. "Deputies!" Sheriff Calloway's voice cut through the chaos. His men surged forward, wrestling Ruth Ellen's husband to the floor as he cursed and thrashed. The sheriff himself snapped iron cuffs around the man's wrists. "Assault in my courtroom," Judge Harrison thundered, standing at his bench. "Remove him to the jail. We'll deal with those charges separately." As the deputies dragged the struggling man out, Ruth Ellen felt Jonas's warm hand close over hers. She looked up to find his eyes shining with unshed tears. Her own spilled freely down her cheeks as relief flooded through her like spring thaw. "Papa!" The girls broke free, swarming around Jonas. He knelt, gathering all four into his arms as they cried and laughed at once. The youngest wrapped her arms around his neck, while the eldest pressed her face against his shoulder. Ruth Ellen watched through her tears as the man she'd feared for so long disappeared through the courthouse doors. The chains binding her heart fell away with the clank of his shackles. Around them, the mood in the courthouse transformed. People who had watched silently for months now stood, applauding. Women who had turned away in the street came forward with embraces. Men who had done nothing that snowy day now shook Jonas's hand. Calling him brother. Sheriff Calloway approached last, his weathered face solemn but softened. He extended his hand to Jonas, who stood to take it. "Reckon I was wrong," the sheriff admitted, his voice gruff with emotion. "Law's one thing, right's another. You showed us the difference." "Much obliged, Sheriff," Jonas replied simply. Ruth Ellen felt the last light of day warm on her face as she stood surrounded by her family, not the one she'd been born to or married into, but the one love had built. Jonas's strong arms circled her shoulders. The girls clustered around them both, and she knew at last what it meant to be truly safe. The courthouse slowly emptied as dusk deepened outside. They remained in its quiet sanctuary, holding each other, feeling the weight of what they'd won: freedom, dignity, and the right to be a family bound by choice rather than blood. The mountain air held a different sweetness as Jonas guided the wagon up the snowy trail toward home. Ruth Ellen sat beside him on the bench, her shoulders finally free of tension, while the girls bounced excitedly in the back. The setting sun painted the peaks in shades of rose and gold, promising a clear evening ahead. As they rounded the last bend, Jonas pulled the team to a halt. Through the trees, he could see a gathering of wagons and horses near the cabin. His hand tightened on the reins until Ruth Ellen touched his arm gently. "Look," she whispered, pointing to Henry's familiar paint pony among the others. "They've come to help." Sure enough, as they drew closer, familiar faces emerged from the crowd. Neighbors who had watched silently for months now stepped forward, carrying lumber and tools. Mr. Peterson from the general store led a gentle-eyed milk cow on a rope. The Anderson sisters carried baskets of preserves and seed packets for spring. Planting. Henry stood apart, his dark eyes warm as he held up a string of smoked venison. "The people say a new home needs food to welcome the spirits," he said, offering the meat to Ruth Ellen with a slight bow. The girls tumbled from the wagon, their laughter bright as sleigh bells as they ran through the fresh snow. The youngest stopped to pet the cow's soft nose, while the others explored the piles of supplies their neighbors had brought. Preacher Alton emerged from the cabin, his Bible tucked under one arm. "The hearth needed sweeping," he said with a gentle smile. "Shall we bless this home properly now?" They gathered in a circle, heads bowed as the preacher's words rose like smoke to heaven. Jonas felt Ruth Ellen's hand slip into his as they prayed. Her fingers warmed despite the evening chill. The work began naturally, without need for direction. Men hauled lumber toward the charred remains of the barn, while women helped Ruth Ellen organize the kitchen. Jonas found himself at the hearth, replacing loose stones as the girls darted in and out, carrying kindling and small tools. When supper time arrived, Ruth Ellen served up beans and cornbread with Henry's venison on their scarred wooden table. The simple meal tasted like a feast. For the first time, they ate without glancing at the door, without listening for hoofbeats on the trail dot as darkness settled outside. Neighbors bid farewell with promises to return for barn raising once the weather warmed. The cabin grew quiet except for the crack of the fire and Ruth Ellen's soft voice, singing an old hymn as she tucked quilts around the girls where they lay on their pallets. Jonas sat in his chair by the hearth, watching the firelight play across their sleeping faces. His chest felt full in a way he'd never known before, not tight with grief or anger, but expanded with something gentler. Ruth Ellen's song washed over him like a blessing as he realized that this was what belonging felt like. This simple peace, this quiet joy of having people to call his own. The winter wind howled outside, but inside Jonas's cabin, warmth and contentment filled every corner. Each day brought new progress as neighbors returned to help raise the barn's sturdy frame. Jonas watched with pride as rough-hewn beams rose against the crystal sky, a testament to community strength. In the crisp morning air, Jonas showed the girls how to handle a mule with gentle hands. "Easy now," he'd say, guiding their small fingers as they fastened harnesses and checked leather straps. He taught them to set rabbit snares, explaining how to read animal tracks in the fresh snow. Ruth Ellen's spirit bloomed like early spring flowers. She worked the soil near the cabin, planting her garden with quiet determination. Her eyes held hope now instead of fear as she marked plots for vegetables and herbs. One evening, as firelight danced across the cabin walls, the family gathered after their simple supper. The eldest daughter, her face glowing in the warm light, climbed onto Jonas's knee. "Good night, Pa," she whispered, wrapping her arms around his neck. One by one, her sisters followed, each precious voice echoing those sweet words. After the girls drifted off to sleep, Jonas sat alone by the crackling hearth, his scarred hands clasped together as he lifted his gaze upward. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, voice rough with emotion, "for giving me a family." Outside, countless stars pierced the velvet night sky, their light catching on pristine snow like scattered diamonds. The cabin, once as empty as the surrounding wilderness now, overflowed with love and laughter. Jonas McCrae, the solitary mountain man, had found his true calling, not in the lonely peaks, but in the precious gift of fatherhood. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.